Welcome, everyone. Today I'm going to tell you about one of the strangest disasters in American history, the Great Molasses Flood. Yes, you heard that correctly. Molasses. In 1919, a massive wave of sticky syrup tore through the streets of Boston at 35 miles per hour, and the story is every bit as bizarre as it sounds. By the end of this talk, you'll never look at a jar of molasses the same way again. Let's start by going back to Boston, 1919. I know what you're thinking. Molasses? The stuff you put in gingerbread cookies? That slow, thick syrup that takes forever to pour out of a jar at breakfast? How could that possibly cause a disaster? Well, imagine 2.3 million gallons of it all released at once, forming a 15-foot wave moving faster than you can run. That's the story we're about to unpack. Trust me, it's wilder than anything you'd expect from a baking ingredient. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll set the scene. Boston in early 1919, a city catching its breath after war and pandemic, blissfully unaware of what's about to hit it. Then we'll meet the villain of our story, a shoddily built steel tank, and the company that cut every corner. After that, we'll relive the disaster itself, minute by stomach-churning minute. Then we'll wade through the sticky aftermath and one of the most important lawsuits in American legal history. Buckle up. Picture Boston in January 1919. World War I had ended just 2 months earlier. The doughboys were shipping home. The devastating Spanish flu pandemic, which killed more people than the war itself, was finally receding. And here's a fun fact. The Red Sox had just won the World Series in 1918. Yes, the Red Sox used to win championships back then. But there was also anxiety simmering. Nationwide prohibition was about to become law in 1920, which meant the entire alcohol industry was in a frantic race against the clock. And sitting right in the middle of all this, on Commercial Street in the North End, was a giant steel tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses, destined to be distilled into industrial alcohol before the taps ran dry. Now let's talk about this tank, and I use the word tank generously. It was built in 1915 by the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol. It was thrown up hastily, with no engineering oversight whatsoever, no blueprints reviewed by any structural engineer. 50 feet tall and 90 feet across, it was essentially a 5-story steel can, sitting in the middle of a dense working-class neighborhood. And here's the kicker. They filled it to absolute capacity on the very first day, without ever testing whether the thing could actually hold the weight. Locals called it the groaning giant because it literally shook and moaned every time a fresh shipment of molasses was pumped in from the harbor. Let's set up the David and Goliath dynamic here because it's central to the whole story. On one side, you've got USIA and Purity Distilling, big business, racing against prohibition, trying to squeeze every ounce of profits before the alcohol ban kicked in. The molasses came in on tankers from the Caribbean sugar islands, got pumped into that rickety tank, and then went to their distillery in Cambridge. On the other side, the North End community. This was a dense, vibrant Italian immigrant neighborhood. Families, laborers, kids playing in the streets, a real community. The tank loomed over everything. And when people started complaining about molasses leaking from the seams, do you know what the company's brilliant solution was? They painted the entire tank brown, specifically to camouflage the leaks. I wish I was making that up. The warning signs were everywhere, and I do mean everywhere. From the very day it was built, molasses seeped through the tank's seams. Local kids figured out they could bring buckets and collect free syrup straight from the leaks, and they did. Workers at the site reported that the tank made deep, unsettling groaning sounds whenever a new shipment arrived, like it was in pain. Engineers who were called to inspect it raised the alarm about serious structural weaknesses, and those warnings were dismissed. The company's entire mitigation strategy consisted of 2 words: brown paint. Out of sight, out of mind. What could possibly go wrong? January 15, 1919. It was an unseasonably warm day. The temperature had shot up from near freezing to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The molasses inside the tank had been cold and sluggish, but as it warmed, it expanded. Physics was about to have the last word. Around midday, workers had just finished pumping in a fresh shipment of warm molasses straight from the Caribbean. The tank was full to bursting. The stage was set. And then, at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, well, let me show you what happened next. At 12:30 p.m., the tank's steel walls ripped apart with a roar that survivors described as being like machine gun fire. 2.3 million gallons of molasses erupted outward. A 15-foot-high wave, traveling at an estimated 35 miles per hour, swept through the north end. Imagine a tsunami, but made of syrup. It crushed buildings, tossed vehicles like bath toys, knocked the elevated railway clean off its supports. People were swept off their feet and hurled against walls. Horses were trapped and suffocated in the sticky flood. The wave was so powerful, it literally moved entire buildings off their foundations. And then, as molasses does, it settled into a thick, suffocating morass that made rescue nearly impossible. First responders waded through waist-deep syrup trying to reach the victims. Let the numbers sink in for a moment. 21 people lost their lives, men, women, and children, crushed by the wave or suffocated in the molasses. 150 were injured, many with broken bones and internal injuries from being hurled by the sheer force of the wave. 6 buildings were completely destroyed, along with a fire station and sections of the elevated railway. The economic damage in today's money is estimated at around $100 million. And here's the deeper cut. For Boston's centuries-old molasses industry, which had been a cornerstone of the city's economy for 300 years, this was the end. The flood didn't just destroy buildings, it wiped out an entire industry overnight. Now, cleaning this up was its own kind of nightmare, and I mean that literally. We're talking about more than 80,000 man-hours of labor. Firefighters used high-pressure saltwater hoses to wash the streets, because fresh water just wasn't cutting it against all that sugar. Workers scraped and scrubbed cobblestones for weeks. The really absurd part? People tracked molasses all over the city, onto subway platforms, into movie theaters, through their kitchens. Boston literally smelled like a giant bakery for months, and the search for victims dragged on agonizingly. The final body, a man named Cesare Niccolo, wasn't found until 4 months after the disaster, floating beneath a wharf in the harbor. 4 months. Let me walk you through the timeline so you can see how this disaster rippled outward. The tank burst on January 15, 1919, at noon, a moment that changed Boston forever. Through the winter and spring, the massive cleanup effort consumed the city: saltwater, fire hoses, endless scraping. On May 12th, 4 months later, they finally found the last missing victim, Cesare Niccolo, floating under a wharf. And in December 1919, a man named Stephen Clufferty died of tuberculosis in a mental hospital. His death was officially attributed to the trauma he'd suffered in the flood. But the story doesn't end there, because between 1920 and 1925, something unprecedented happened. 119 plaintiffs banded together and took on USIA in court. What came next changed American law forever, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. So did anyone pay for this sticky catastrophe? You bet they did. In 1920, a tidal wave of lawsuits, 110 civil suits, came crashing down on USIA, eventually consolidated into one monster case with 119 plaintiffs. This wasn't just a local spat, it was the first significant class action lawsuit against a major American company. The court's investigation dragged on for over 5 years, longer than the tank itself stood. More than 1,000 people testified, including engineers, construction experts, and physicists, who basically said, yeah, that tank was a disaster waiting to happen. And the verdict? USIA was held liable. The tank was fundamentally, fatally flawed. This case didn't just deliver justice to the North End, it set the legal precedent for every corporate accountability lawsuit that followed. Without the molasses flood, there's no Enron case, no Aaron Brockovich. Sweet justice, indeed. And here we are, more than 100 years later, and the great molasses flood still sticks with us. Literally, some say. Residents of the North End swear that on hot summer days, when the sun hits the old cobblestones just right, you can still catch a whiff of molasses in the air. Is it a ghost? Residual syrup in the soil? Pure imagination? Honestly, who cares? It's a perfect ending to a story that sounds made up, but is absolutely, ridiculously true. 21 lives lost, a neighborhood leveled, a company held accountable, and a legal legacy that reshaped American justice. All because someone cut corners on a giant tank of sticky syrup. So the next time you pour molasses on your pancakes, give a little nod to Boston. That city took one for the team.